Well, good evening and welcome to this week's podcast for Platform Launchers. I'm John Stange, and on the call with me live right now, we have guests from a variety of places in the United States. We have people in the Northeast. We have a good contingent actually from the Northeast. We also have some people that are in the South. We have some people that are in the Midwest. We also have people, well, let's see, we have one in Colorado. So we're working our way further west. We don't have anyone in California tonight, but we've got some good representation tonight on the call live with me right here. I know you can't hear him. I know you can't see him, but our members club is here on the call with me. And we have a lot of fun. We were just talking about a variety of things related to our platforms. And we're segueing now into talking about our main topic tonight. And that's the art of using podcast interviews to connect with a wider audience. And I'm just going to let you know ahead of time, even before I get into the content that I have prepared here, that podcast interviews can be a game changer when it comes to building your platform and when it comes to marketing your platform. Podcast interviews, I did so many interviews last year, and it was wonderful. It really, really helped. I had a book to launch last year, and so it seemed like every day I was doing another interview, and some days I had more than one. And if you're chatty like I am, it could be a really fun thing to do, and you get to meet new people. One of the folks here in our members club, he's here on the call with me right now. I actually met during that time, Dr. Brad Miller, and so you get to meet new people, you get to hear from them, you get to share about some of the things you're working on. And we're going to be talking about that tonight. We're going to be talking about the art of using podcast interviews to connect with a wider audience. Now, if you've been listening to podcasts for any length of time, interviews are something that I'm certain you've grown accustomed to. And what you find is you've got experts, you've got authors, you've got celebrities regularly being invited to be guests on various shows, and this has mutual benefit when it's done. This arrangement benefits both the hosts and the guests alike, because guests are given an opportunity to promote whatever their current project is. Sometimes I've had people on my podcast that are promoting a new book, or sometimes they're promoting a new movie, or promoting a tour that they're going to be doing, or something like that. And so guests are given the opportunity to promote that. And then hosts, what ends up happening if you're the host and you're bringing some of these people onto your show, you gain credibility and you tend to grow a listening base. So you're growing in credibility, you're adding new listeners, and you're doing this by featuring guests who are either there to either entertain or inform or inspire your audience, or, potentially do all three. Now, I want to start by talking about the process of inviting people onto your show. So just think about that for a second. This is a question that I actually get a lot. People want to know, how do you get some of these guests that you're getting? So I'm going to tell you exactly what I do to be able to bring some of these, what I consider bigger names, onto a show. I've been podcasting since 2015 consistently, but for many years, I did not invite guests onto my shows. And now I'm regularly speaking with people that I consider celebrities and other highly valuable guests. But the process of doing that, it happened almost by accident. And it's kind of a funny story. I have a friend, and he knew that I had a book coming out. And so he offered to connect me with another author. And in the process of introducing me to that author, my friend happened to also mention that my shows had millions of downloads. So he was really, supporting me, trying to encourage me. And he happened to mention that. And that resulted in the author thinking that I was inviting him to be a guest on one of my shows. That really wasn't what this was supposed to be about. This was just going to be a conversation, author to author. But he heard millions of downloads and immediately assumed that this was the invitation to do an interview. And so I got a call from his assistant, and his assistant contacted me and asked to set up a meeting and wanted to set up a time for an interview with him. And I remember at the time thinking, I don't even offer interviews on my shows. I don't even do this, but I went through the process like it was an interview. I interviewed him for my show. I treated it like an interview instead of a conversation. I asked some of the same questions that I would have asked. And I just did that conversationally and interview style at the same time. And I figured if I liked how it came out, if it sounded like a good interview, I thought, well, maybe I'll feature it on my podcast as a bonus episode. And if I don't like it, then I thought I don't have to air it. And so that was kind of the experiment. And it turned out that It went great. And because it went great, what it ended up doing is it inspired me to start thinking about who else I might be willing to have come on my show and talk about their things, whatever they're working on, whatever they're promoting. And so what I started doing was I started going through a list of some of my childhood heroes. And growing up, I used to listen to a band called Striper. And by the way, they're still pumping out music like crazy, and they sound just as good as they ever did. And I actually saw them in concert a couple of years ago, and I thought, boy, these guys are still great. And amazingly, this is kind of amazing, and I hope that they hear this, but I was amazed that they've stayed fit, because a lot of times people just kind of phone it in at a certain season of life, and they did not phone it in. And the lead singer of Striper is a man named Michael Sweet. And I thought, I mean, I had posters of their band all over my room when I was growing up. I just invited him to be on my show. I wanted to see what would happen. And he agreed. Now, this is kind of weird and funny at the same time, but when I was a kid, I was a huge fan of professional wrestling. And there was a wrestler at the time that I liked. His name was Nikita Koloff. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to see if I could get him to come on the show. And so I invited him to come on, and he said, sure. So he came on the show. And I thought, wait, this is going so well. And then I just started inviting all sorts of people whose podcasts I listened to or books that I read. So I had Christy Wright on the show. I had Dan Miller on the show. I had John Deloney on the show. I don't know if you know Alveda King. She's the niece of Dr. Martin Luther King. I invited her to come on my show, and she came on. I invited John Cooper. John Cooper is the lead singer of a band named Skillet. I invited him to come on my show, and we hit it off so well that he said, hey, I'm going to be in your area. Any chance that you'd want to come and meet before one of my shows and bring your family? And I'll introduce my family to your family. And I thought, what? And so that was wonderful. He offered it, and he fulfilled that offer. So that was really, really cool to see. And a variety of other big names, they kept saying yes. And then I thought, all right, well, these celebrities are saying yes. I ought to open up the door for people that I know in my day-to-day life, people that I know that I could trust, people that I know personally. And I thought, let me invite them to be guests on the show as well. And so it's been a joy to discover that basically the people that we all seem to admire, people we all seem to look up to, they're just like us. I was really impressed with some of the people that I've had the opportunity to meet over the past year and a half since I really started incorporating interviews. And I'd encourage you that this might be something really worth looking into. You would be surprised if you have a podcast, you'll be surprised at who might be willing to join you for your show, even if it's just for a few minutes. There are people that will surprise you with their willingness to do a podcast. But how do you get these people to come onto your show? I think there's a few things that help. So let me give you 4 suggestions. These are things that I think will help you if you're trying to bring certain people onto your show. The first one is this. First of all, demonstrate that you take your show seriously by producing good content on a consistent basis. So if you are not consistently releasing an episode on a fixed day, so if your show is a weekly show, release that episode every day on a certain, or every week on a certain day. If your show is a daily episode or a daily show, make sure you're releasing daily content, but make it good content that you release on a consistent basis. And that demonstrates that you take your show seriously. Don't start a show and then update it, today and tomorrow, and then take 4 months off, and then update it one more time, and then take a year off, and it doesn't demonstrate the consistency that you want to demonstrate. So if you really want to start lining up people that are, I would say bigger names, produce good content on a consistent basis. It demonstrates that you take your show seriously. And by the way, if your show has faded, not a problem. Just revive the show, demonstrate the consistency for a few weeks or even a few months, and then begin the process. Second piece of advice is this: reach out to their publicists when possible. Now, if you're not familiar with working with publicists, a publicist is basically somebody that an artist or an author or a celebrity or whomever, they will hire this person, and their job is to arrange media events for their clients. So they set up TV interviews, podcast interviews, radio interviews, publications that want to feature a guest article, things of that nature. And I have discovered that you'll have much greater success if you go through publicists than if you attempt to book interviews with the artists and authors directly. Their job is to perform and create content. The publicist is the one that works with media and works with marketing. So reach out to the publicists. You'll end up getting on the schedule much quicker. And by the way, the publicists sometimes remind the artists and the authors of their interviews that are coming up. So it's really helpful to you as well. Third piece of advice is this: have a decent website. And that's something that I encourage people to have, regardless of the nature of your platform. But have a decent website that you can direct artists and publicists to when you invite them on your show. So what they'll do is they'll go and check out what you've shared with them. That'll give them a good opportunity to learn more about you and to learn more about the content you create. And it will, I think, help them make a decision as to whether or not to agree to be a guest on your show. But when they see that you have a decent website, when they like what your content is all about, and they look at this and they say, this person's really got their act together. They're producing good and consistent content. They've got a decent website. It really puts you in a good position to be able to make that request. And then number 4, and I think this is really important, and I don't know how easily you get discouraged, but if you're doing this sort of thing, let me encourage you, don't be discouraged when you're told no, or sometimes when you don't get a reply. And I'll confess to you, this happens to me all the time. When I get a no, I just tell myself, their loss. They don't want free publicity. I'll give it to somebody else. And so just kind of have that attitude. You know your podcast is good. You know that it's worth someone coming on and being a guest. And if someone says no, sometimes it's just because they're extremely busy. You know, there was someone that I wanted to have on my show a while back, and they couldn't do it just because time didn't allow. It wasn't a forever no. It was just a temporary no. And sometimes there's two people in particular I can think of. One is a sports star that I admire, and I've reached out to him and I have not received a reply. And another's a musician that I admire, and I've reached out to her multiple times. I even talked to her publicist, and her publicist said I cannot get a response out of her. And so I won't tell you the names of these people, because I have the hopes that someday they might come on the show. But just the same, sometimes you get a no and sometimes you don't get a reply. Don't let it discourage you when you're trying to get people on your show. Just keep plugging away. Let yourself know, remind yourself that there is somebody that will want to be on your show that is a high value guest that would be a blessing to talk to and a blessing to be able to introduce to your audience, and just focus your attention and your energy on those who do want to be on your show. Let me suggest a few things about how to structure the interview. If you bring somebody on your show, I think there's a way to do this and a way not to do this. And by the way, there's an art to this. And this list I'm about to share with you is not necessarily a must do in the sense that you have to do every one of these details in some specific order. But these are some principles that I find really helpful when a guest agrees to come on your show. I think you should do your best to make it a positive experience for them. And so some of the things that I have in my mind when I'm interviewing a guest is, first of all, I like to give them a good introduction. I want them to know just how much I appreciate the content that they create, and I want my audience to know that. And so when I have a guest on, I try and do my best to give them a good introduction. It sets a really good tone for the entire interview going forward. Secondly, ask a mix of questions related to what they do. So think about what they're doing. Think about the content they're producing, and keep bringing the conversation back to what they do. So often people bring things back to what the host is doing. You know, they just want to talk about themselves, but you've brought a guest onto your show. Ask them a mix of questions related to what they do. And related to that, let them do most of the talking. I don't know if you've ever heard an interview where the one doing the interview seems to do most of the talking, and that seems very counterproductive to me. So let your guest do most of the talking. The next principle that I think is useful is demonstrate that you're actively listening by asking some follow-up questions. So they might tell you something really interesting in the conversation, and the temptation you're going to have is to go to your list of questions that you've already typed up and not really even ask a follow-up question related to whatever has just been shared. But I think it's a better interview, and it's more polite to demonstrate that you're actively listening by asking some follow-up questions before you get to whatever you've pre-prepared. You might ask a pre-prepared question and then you get a really interesting answer, and you could either jump to your next pre-prepared question or you could ask a follow-up related to what your guest just said. And I think sometimes that's the better route to take. Ask the follow-ups. But when you are preparing a list of questions that you're going to talk about ahead of time, think about it this way. So you don't just want data questions. There's a variety of things that you could ask. Ask them questions about what they think. Ask them questions about how they feel, and ask them questions about what they're doing. So have a mixture of that. You want to know about what they're thinking, how they're feeling, and what they're doing. So you're talking to the head, the heart, and the hands, or the intellect, the emotion, and the will. It makes for a well-balanced, well-rounded interview. And by the way, if you're a public speaker, when you're putting together a speech, have those metrics in the back of your mind as well. Speak to the head, speak to the heart, speak to the hands, or you could also say intellect, emotion, and will, whatever you want. But when you're preparing your questions here for an interview, have questions that address what they think, how they feel, and what they're doing. Then take some time to promote their project and promote their website. So make sure that's out there, because they've taken time to do your show. Make sure you give them a good plug for how people can find them after the interview. And ahead of time, and maybe I could have even mentioned this earlier, find out how much time they're available and stick to that time. I remember when I had Alveda King on my show, I thought it was going to be a 45-minute interview. And right at the start of the interview, before we started recording, she said, "Now, how much time do you typically budget for interviews?" And I said, "Oh, usually maybe 30 to 45 minutes. And she said, "I have to be honest with you, I really only have about 15 minutes today." And she said, "Can we make that work?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so we did a 15-minute interview. And when we got to that mark, when we got to that 15-minute spot, I ended the interview promptly on time. I wanted to respect her time because I was pretty impressed that she was willing to carve out time to do the show. And so when you find out how much time your guest has, stick to that. And sometimes they might be able to give you some extra time. Sometimes the interview goes so well that they say, "You know what, I just want to stay with this for a little bit longer," and they stay with it. And it's wonderful. But oftentimes they're on a deadline, and we want to respect that. And then after it's all said and done, and you've got everything edited and it's ready to go and you've published it, send them a link to your episode once it goes live, because who knows, maybe they'll share it on their social media. And if you have a well-known artist or author sharing content that you've created on their social media, that can be a huge boost to your podcast or to your platform. So definitely send them a link to your episode once it goes live. I have to confess, I don't always remember to do this. And but when I have remembered to do it, I have found it very worth doing. Now, not everybody shares it, and that's fine, but some share it, and sometimes they share it down the road. Sometimes they don't share it the day you send it. So be patient, but see what happens. Maybe they'll share it. And so send them a link to the episode once it goes live. So that's one part of guesting that I want to talk about today. But let's talk about something else. So we started off by talking about bringing guests onto our shows. And for the next part here, I just want to kind of round out our conversation today with talking about becoming a guest on other shows. So if you've been developing a platform, if you're producing content, if you're writing books, if you've got a show that you want people to know about, being a guest on those shows definitely helps. But how can you start a train of podcast guesting opportunities that will help you promote your platform and the services that you offer? And by the way, this is one of the most effective ways to promote something. Podcast interviews, extremely effective. Well, the good news is that podcast hosts are always looking for quality guests. So this is not as hard as you might fear. If you're going to be an interesting guest, someone that's kind of fun to talk to, someone that is like a bright spot in someone's day with an interesting story to share or an interesting skill that you can bring to the table, or just some interesting content that you've been creating, podcast hosts love guests that can bring some of those things to the table, and they're always looking for quality guests. So have no fear. So here's a few suggestions if you're interested in being a guest. And this is kind of coming from the perspective of a podcast host, what they're looking for a guest to do. So one of the things that I'd encourage you to do, I'm going to encourage you to do three things here. All right. So number one is this: create a PDF. So just a one sheet, just a piece of paper or a digital piece of paper, a PDF that includes things like your picture, a one paragraph bio, your website link, and a list of subjects that you're available to talk about. And, I'll also say this: if you had an interesting experience somewhere along the way, or if you have a unique skill, you can mention that as well, but have that all just on something that's really quick and easy to read. Wouldn't even hurt if it has large font. You don't want to make this, the type of thing that feels like work for someone to peruse. So just create a PDF, something that you could email really easily that has, again, your picture, your bio, a website link, and a list of subjects that you're available to talk about. And then reach out. This is number 2 now. Reach out to shows in your niche, or reach out to shows in related niches to yours. It might not be your exact niche, but reach out to shows that are related, and include the PDF when you email them. And let the host know if you're familiar with his or her show, and then offer to come on the show as a guest if the host ever has a last-minute cancellation. That's something that I've had happen to me so many times, where someone is scheduled to come on the show. Actually, just had it happen to me last week. I had someone that was scheduled to come on the show, and it was a medical thing. There's nothing they could do about it. They had to cancel last minute. And so it's really helpful if you have someone that says, you know what, if you ever have a last minute cancellation, you'd always reach out to me. That's a way that you're really serving the host of the podcast that you're trying to get on. And again, this happens all the time. So having a reserve list of guests, to have that on hand, could be a huge help to certain hosts. And if you offer that, I think that also demonstrates, I think, a little bit of a humility, in the sense where you're saying, listen, I know you probably got other great guests lined up, but if you ever have a last minute cancellation, let me know if you would want me to come on and chat, because I'd love to be on your show. And then number 3, if you have a show, invite them to be a guest as well. I think it demonstrates goodwill. I think it can help facilitate a culture of mutual help between your platform and their platform. So if you have a show, invite them to be a guest as well. And these can be some useful ways that you could, before you know it, start doing more and more podcast interviews and really get that train going. And by the way, a lot of times, if you start doing podcast interviews, what'll happen is other hosts will hear you on other podcasts and then reach out to you. I recently reached out to someone that I had heard on another podcast, and I asked that podcast host, someone I was friends with, I said, could you give me contact information for this person? They have a really interesting story, and I'd love to feature them on my show as well. And so he did that, and I brought this guest on my show, and it's really useful. And so the more you get out there, the more shows you're probably going to find yourself able to do. But I'm telling you, when you start podcast guesting, I think that this could easily be the rocket fuel that your platform is looking for. If you feel things are stagnant, if you feel like maybe you're not getting enough traction, or things aren't growing as quickly as you'd like, this is really something to look into, whether it be inviting guests onto your show, or whether it be doing interviews on the shows of others. This can be a quick way to add a noticeable boost to the work you're doing and the audience base that you're attempting to grow. So give this thought, think about it, and see what you can do. I think these tips will certainly help you get started, and might help you get that train going as you're trying to either bring guests on your show or become a guest on the shows of others. Now, in just a second, our members club is going to have a robust discussion all about this and kind of exchange ideas. And I know those of you that listen to the podcast don't get to hear those discussions or get to meet our members club, but I want to invite you to become part of this. And it's a very simple way to do this. You could come and be a part of Platform Launchers, become part of our members club. We always give people a 2-week trial so that they can come and see what this is like ahead of time, and just kind of get a feel for it and decide if it's for them. But if you want to see what our members club is like and join us for some of these calls live, and be able to look through what's becoming a vast video library of previous training sessions and discussions, and some of our bonus office hours time where we talk about some of the technical details related to launching our platforms and building our platforms. You can do this all at platformlaunchers.com, We'd encourage you to come and check it out. We'd love to have you as part of the group. And if we could help you launch your platform and help build some encouragement and accountability into what you're trying to do, we'd love to be a part of it. So again, go to platformlaunchers.com. You can try it out for 2 weeks and see if it's the right fit for you. And if so, we'd love to have you as part of the group. But right now, it's time to jump over to our members club, have our Q&A time, and to our podcast listeners, we'll talk to you again next week.